Okay, thanks everyone for joining the webinar. This is IBM and Gatsby Themes, Driving Impact Through Design. A couple of announcements before we get started. First, I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are joined by a couple of very exciting speakers who I will introduce in just a minute. This webinar is also being recorded, so if you miss any portion of it, the recording will be available on our website later today. The link will also be sent to all of the registrants via email later today as well. All of the participants are on mute, so as you have questions during the webinar, please use the question chat window to submit your questions. We have a couple of panelists that will be answering the questions throughout the presentations, and we have also saved time at the end for Q&A as well. So we'll be sure we have plenty of time for questions. A quick announcement also, we are doing a Twitter AMA Ask Me Anything right after the webinar, so if there are some things that we don't get to, then please, feel free to join us on Twitter and get your questions answered there. So next, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Vince Picone is a front-end developer working on the carbon design system at IBM in Austin, Texas. Vince is a huge design and React nerd with a passion for accessible, blazing fast websites. And next we have Alison Joseph, who is a senior front-end developer at IBM. She's responsible for the development of the carbon design system's web properties. When Alison's not teaching her daughters to code, she's trying to teach her dogs CrossFit. And I'm now realizing that we really should have gotten a video of that. And last, of course, we have Chris Biscardi, who is an independent consultant who has a long history with Gatsby, having been contributing since version 0.7. He has been working on Gatsby themes since the inception of the project. So we're really excited to have all of the speakers here today. This is a reminder of the Twitter AMA that we're doing after the webinar. You can tag at GatsbyJS or use the hashtag GatsbyJSAMA. So either one of those or both will get you connected with us on to submit your questions on Twitter. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Chris.
Hello. Let's see if I can. How's that?
Great, we can see your slides.
Wonderful. So today I'm going to go over composition in the context of themes. I think the wonderful people from Carbon will be going over a little bit more about how do you use themes and what are they useful for and things like that. So what I'm going to do is do a very quick dive into a little bit of the technical backings behind how themes are composable and a bit about why they're composable. So first, if you're not familiar with Gatsby themes, basically there are a couple of core concepts that you would want to know about. The first one is composition, and the second one is shadowing. There's quite a bit to learn after that, or quite a bit that you can do that grows out of this, but we're probably not going to be talking about any of that in this presentation today. At least I won't be. The Carbon people will be. So recently themes went stable. We released 2 official themes. One is Gatsby Theme Blog and the other is Gatsby Theme Notes. Gatsby Theme Blog is a blog, basically, that will give you a set of posts. You can write them in MDX. They turn into website or URLs on your website. Gatsby Theme Notes is a very similar concept. You can write MDX files. It's meant for shorter form, more informal content, whereas most people write blog posts and they're very long. Most people write notes and they're just sort of like, okay, I watched this thing, I took a note. I watched this thing, I took a note. So we have a starter that's called Gatsby Starter Theme that sets you up with a site that uses Gatsby Theme Blog, Gatsby Theme Notes, and the code in your own directory. This is important because it gets at the core of why composition matters, right? If we have two themes and our site, how do we take those three different things and turn them into a single Gatsby site? Which brings us into sort of what is a Gatsby site. And when you look at the fundamentals in terms of the code, what a Gatsby site is the Gatsby config. The Gatsby config controls everything else about your Gatsby site. It controls your site metadata, it controls which plugins you use, and it controls a bunch of other things. The fact that it controls which plugins you use is really important because not only are themes plugins, but the way that you source data, the way that you transform data, the way that you set up all of your components and set up any of your pages are all considered plugins by Gatsby. So if we consider Gatsby config to be the core driving factor of a Gatsby site, we have to sort of ask what are themes and how do they relate to Gatsby sites? And the answer is that they are actually, a theme is a Gatsby site. So if you take a theme or if you take a starter and you build it, you can basically copy that starter into a different directory, publish it as an npm package, and now you have a theme. Which means that any subsection of your Gatsby site can be packaged up as an npm package and shipped as a theme. So it's Gatsby all the way down, right? If our Gatsby sites are driven by Gatsby configs and our Gatsby themes are Gatsby sites, then our Gatsby themes are driven by Gatsby configs as well. And it's basically Gatsby all the way down. If a theme is a site and your site is a site and they're all driven by Gatsby configs, that means we have a bunch of Gatsby configs to turn into a single config, right? What do we do about having Gatsby configs that define plugins and site metadata and other aspects of our site in multiple different places? And the answer is we basically need one config. So if you've never seen a Gatsby config file, this short code example will show you what a Gatsby config file looks like. It's basically module.exports equals an object, and that object, for our purposes today, contains site metadata, which is an object, and plugins, which is an array. So if we take the blog config, the notes config, and our source, we end up with a Gatsby site. The blog Gatsby config, the notes Gatsby config, and our Gatsby site itself are all composed into a single Gatsby site. So the question becomes how? How do we construct this one Gatsby config that we then use to build out our end site, right? And if you consider a Gatsby config that has the following plugins in it. So we have, as we've been talking about, Gatsby Theme Blog and Gatsby Theme Notes. In this case, they're not configured with anything special. So it's just two plugins in the array. And this Gatsby config sits in our site. Then what we basically have is an ordered array of the configs that we need to merge into a single config. We have the blog config, we have the notes config, and we have our site source config. And we're going to talk about this hypothetical merge flat function for how these configs get merged together. But this merge flat function doesn't actually exist, so don't get too hung up on the naming there. So how does this hypothetical merge flat function work, right? If we have a Gatsby config in multiple places, our Gatsby theme blog has a Gatsby config, which is what we're looking at here. And that contains more plugins and more site metadata, right? So when we start running this process, what happens is we take the Gatsby theme blog out of the plugins. We check to see what is in that Gatsby theme blog Gatsby config. We take those properties out and add them to the original Gatsby config, and they get placed before Gatsby theme blog. So now we've run one pass on one of the plugins. We've pulled out Gatsby plugin MDX, which was in Gatsby theme blog. We've pulled out Gatsby source file system, which was also in Gatsby theme blog. And then we also treat Gatsby theme blog as its own plugin because we also want to run the Gatsby node and Gatsby SSR files from the theme. So if we take a look at Gatsby theme notes, it has a very similar setup, but the setup is two different plugins, right? So it doesn't have Gatsby plugin MDX, it doesn't have Gatsby source file system. And this could happen for any number of themes, right? So we could have any number of Gatsby configs here. And what we end up with is a Gatsby config that is effectively the merging of all of these objects together. So we end up with all of the plugins in Gatsby theme blog, followed by Gatsby theme blog. All of the plugins in Gatsby theme notes, followed by Gatsby theme notes. And then any plugins that are in our site Gatsby config. So anything local, anything that would be next to our source directory. And this hypothetical merge flat function is basically object.assign, right? So if you take a Gatsby config and you say that this Gatsby config is an object, it has two properties, site metadata and plugins. And I have another Gatsby config, and it also has two properties, site metadata and plugins. You can basically think of them as taking one object and the other object and sticking it into an object.assign or a spread operator, if you're more familiar with that, and combining the two objects. It's not quite that, but it's the right mental model. So the core concepts here are when you use themes, what you effectively get is an array of plugins which may or may not have Gatsby configs. These plugins are ordered, so they always come in the same order, and you can rearrange that order in your Gatsby config if you need to. The order is important because they're merged with object.assign. And in some cases, like plugins, they get concatenated, right? So if you define plugins in multiple themes, you end up with all of the plugins in your result Gatsby config. As for site metadata is an object. So if you specify the same key in two themes in site metadata, the last theme in the array of plugins that exists will win. So the order matters. So they're basically merged with object.assign. They're unified into a single config. And that leads us to the other core concept in themes, which is shadowing or component shadowing, as you may know it. And shadowing works the same way. So shadowing takes this array of plugins in the same order that we just did this merge flat function, right? So we've got Gatsby plugin MDX, Gatsby source file system, Gatsby theme blog, the other two plugins from notes, Gatsby theme notes, and then our site. And then in shadowing, the order also matters. So the last plugin to shadow a specific file will win, right? Because we can't have two files that are the same file being used in the same place. And the ordering is the exact same as we merge the Gatsby configs. So that's it. That's just about all the time I have. It's a short dive into composition and how themes get composed within each other. The core takeaway here is that if you build themes, they will have multiple Gatsby configs. Those Gatsby configs will get merged into a single Gatsby config that then gets used to build your actual site. And if you think about the other features of theming and the other features of Gatsby itself, they all follow the same pattern where there's this array. If you are choosing a thing from the array, like a file with which to shadow, it will always be the last one declared, which means your site always beats out every other theme, but also later themes beat out earlier themes in the array. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Chris. And we've had a few questions come in, and we'll be sure that Chris and the other panelists are addressing them. So keep your questions coming. We'll get to them through the presentations, and then we'll also have time at the end to answer a few questions as well. And just another quick reminder that the webinar is being recorded, and the link will be posted on our website and sent to all registrants after the live event. So before we get to our next presenters, we have a polling question. So you should see the question come up, but if everybody can kind of jump in and give their answers there. What's your favorite way of styling Gatsby projects? So you can choose one of the options below: SAS, regular CSS, emotion, style, components, or other. If your answer is other, feel free to give more details about that in the chat window as well. So we'll give everybody a minute. Let's see, great, we're over 30% voted now, so we'll get over 50. Before we close the poll. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Great, we're over 60%. So I'm going to close the poll and I'll share the results. Okay, so 38% styled components, and then SAS is 34%. Those are the top two. Very interesting. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Alison and Vince, and for their portion of the presentation.
Cool, thank you. All right. Share the screen.
Great, we can see your slides.
Awesome. Okay. All right, first of all, I just wanted to throw up a link to our theme documentation, which is actually built with our theme, if anyone wanted to take a look as we're going through this presentation. All right, we're just going to go through a little bit of Carbon's backstory and then jump more into like what we're doing with the themes and some of the powerful moments that themes are bringing to us. Okay, cool. So for anyone that doesn't know, Carbon is the design system for IBM. So the original Carbon website houses all of our components and style guides, content guidelines, things like that. So the original Carbon website was just your standard homegrown React site, but it was built by devs that weren't on our team anymore, and so it was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, and especially difficult for a lot of our non-technical contributors to make any like significant updates without getting development help. So around last summer, the dev team made the decision to switch to Gatsby, and our updated site launched in October, which was awesome. We were able to quickly onboard our visual and content designers, get them up and running and editing content. And then I'd say a couple months after we launched, we got the conversion to MDX, which was finished maybe in January. So that made it even faster and easier to update. So of course, as soon as we launched this, there were a lot of other teams at IBM that wanted in. They wanted a website that they could edit the same way, that looked the same way. The problem was, at the time, the only way to do that was to they would fork the website and just copy it. They would strip out all of the content they didn't need, which in the Carbon site, I think has over 200 pages. So there's a lot of cleanup they had to do. There's a lot of configuration settings they might not understand. Not everybody at IBM understands React. Not everybody has worked with Gatsby. And it also meant that as our designers were making updates to our website, that none of that was trickling down. And the same goes for bug fixes and the latest version of that. But luckily for us, that was right around when Gatsby was talking about themes, and they were experimental, and so we kind of dove right into that. I think we have another poll. Cliffhanger before I pass it off to Vince.
Yep, give me 1 second. All right. You're on a deserted island and can only bring one Gatsby plugin. Which one is it? Go ahead and submit your answers there. By the way, I love this question, Vince.
Yeah, I feel like it's tough putting it at the beginning. I don't know if I've sold the theme just yet, maybe. But...
Okay, we're at 50% voted. We'll give people just a couple more seconds to get their votes in. Okay, great. I'm going to close the poll, share the results. Oh, looks like Gatsby source file system is 38%. But
Cool.
Carbon Design theme is still in the running.
Did we get it? I can't, it looks 0% for us. That's okay.
Gatsby theme Carbon is 14%.
Wow, that's awesome. You all have a lot of trust in this. The thing is, though, if you're paying attention, you'll know that like Gatsby Theme Carbon actually includes those other three. So technically, the correct answer would have been to take Gatsby Theme Carbon.
The correct answer.
Yes, yeah. Okay, cool. So awesome. So this is the moment when we enter into like the world of Gatsby themes. And so while the technical choices behind your configuration and the scope of your theme is really important when you're designing and developing a theme, it can really vary dramatically based on the needs that you're trying to address with your theme. So here I'd like to focus a little bit more on sort of the human aspect of empowering content authors, and that's sort of the thing I see as the real triumph of Gatsby themes thus far. So the big wins with Gatsby theme that we've seen has been development speed. So we broke ground on the Gatsby theme April 15th was the first commit, and we had two teams, both with a June 1st deadline, 45 days. And both of those teams had 0 React experience, 0 Gatsby experience, but both teams were able to hit their June 1st deadline, I think, with a product that everyone was really excited about here at IBM Design. So the development speed is critical. We get this sort of visual solidarity, the core UI components that define sort of our shell and navigation, bring this uniformity across the various sites using the theme, which is great. Also, the shared features and fixes, the community involvement grew tremendously after using the theme. We have teams submitting core elements like an edit and GitHub link for markdown pages, and even content MDX global components that you can use in your content, designers can use. Submitting both of those things back, and I think that was really just due to the fact that it's a shared tool. They're speaking, as apples to apples, and they benefit from submitting back to the theme. And we'll dive into a little bit of those stories in a second. And then also the theme managed configuration. Like Alison mentioned, not everyone is familiar with the intricacies of setting up Gatsby image with MVX, or the sort of kind of bare metal Gatsby configuration, or things that we don't necessarily want people using the theme, people making sites to look like Carbon. We don't necessarily want them to have to own that configuration. And especially if we make updates or changes to the dependencies, those are things that we want to percolate down without necessarily having the theme developers own that information. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the revelations that everyone encounters. We've seen it time and time again with various teams building with the theme. They kind of go through whatever the phases of denial are. They go through this, but it's revelatory, awesome moments I think that they have in developing themes. The first one being oh wow, you're really just writing fancy Markdown pretty much, and just in writing Markdown and placing it in the magic folder, you get a site that looks and feels like Carbon and the IBM design language. And this was a big selling point for people that were just thinking about getting started with not necessarily your React experience. The second one is sort of takes a moment for people to get, and that like you can't be blocked by the theme because, like Chris mentioned, the theme itself behind the scenes is really just a Gatsby config. And so when you're meant to override any kind of like configuration or components or adding a new feature, all of those things you're completely empowered to do. Anything we would do at the theme level, site developers can also do. And so that was another big selling point. We had agencies that were using the theme to develop sites for IBM internally, and this was a big concern of theirs. It's like they don't want to be blocked by upstream theme needs. And then finally, the sort of revelation is the immense power of shadowing. And so I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that because I think shadowing is something that's one of those like sort of like coding paradigms that once you see it, it becomes the hammer that you try and solve all of your problems with. It's really powerful and I think a lot of fun. So first, really quick, what is shadowing? Shadowing essentially allows developers to augment or replace files in a theme. So shadowed files will go in a directory named after the theme. So in your source directory of Gatsby, you'll have a Gatsby theme carbon or Gatsby theme blog. And then anything that goes after the name, the Gatsby theme carbon in this example, you're essentially exposing all of the source files of Gatsby theme carbon. So if you put a file in Gatsby theme carbon /component/footer, anything in that folder, specifically at that file, is going to replace the theme's version of that file. And the theme will reach for your component first and use that to build out your site. Another important aspect, particularly when you're shadowing React components, is that they are going to receive the same props as our like core UI element. And that's something that is extremely powerful. We'll kind of dive into how shadowing is used at different layers. So here's the sort of shadowing revelations, another layer of like really cool things that you slowly realize that you can do with shadowing. The first one is for props, where you're taking our component, providing additional props, and then re-exporting it. This allows users or developers to really easily, without totally overriding all of the logic in a component, they can provide either children or a special like modifier, and then re-export it. The second one is like whole components. Like if somebody wanted to totally replace our left nav or totally replace our accordion or what have you, they're totally empowered to do so. All they have to do is create their own component at that specific file they want to shadow and then re-export it. And then finally, the last one here is that you can shadow any file, really. It's not just limited to React components. And so we'll dive into that a little bit. I'll go step by step. So the first one is shadowing to provide props. And this is the one that is, at the very least, is pretty essential when you're first using our theme in particular. Like there's specific components that, like the header, a title in the header, the footer links, where you're meant to do this shadowing pattern so that we know how to provide content that can populate our bespoke like UI components, our shell. So you'll see at the top, you import the component that you're shadowing with the URL, and then you create your like custom component that provides the additional information. In this case, you're providing children, and then you export it. And so that means that when the Gatsby theme is like looking for the component to put in the header, it's going to see that you're shadowing, it's going to reach for this, and it's going to use this over our like default lorem ipsum header. An important bit here when you're shadowing these components is that you always want to, if you're just providing additional props, you always want to provide the props that the original component was expecting back to it, because if you only provide the prop that you need, sometimes you'll miss out on something that the component you're wrapping is expecting. The next is shadowing the component as a whole. So here's where we're creating a totally novel component. You obviously don't need to import the shadow component. So here we're importing our carbon type styles, and we're using emotion to create a new span that sort of takes the place of whatever the header was doing. And if you want to see the props that the original component was getting, you'll see here I'm just kind of logging out the props, so you can say oh, okay, it was getting certain styling options or on-click handler or what have you. Cool. So finally is the shadow everything, right? So this is where you don't necessarily have to shadow our React components. We use SAS modules, so you could replace an entire style sheet. You can provide data. So we have our Prism, our syntax highlighting theme is defined as a Prism theme object. So in just replacing the Prism theme.js file with your own Prism theme, that's going to be the theme that's used to empower our syntax highlighting features. Finally, this is something really cool that we were just started playing with, is that we have a search component in our header, but we don't support natively doing site-wide search, and we want people to be able to use third-party services like Algolia or what have you to connect to that. So we have a hook called useSearch that, in shadowing it, you can provide whatever integrations you need to get site-wide search working on your page. And so, yeah, and then it would in turn reveal a search component in the header after it's been shadowed. If you're not familiar with hooks, it's kind of like a new React API that allows you to encapsulate logic or behavior. And so shadowing hooks, I feel like, is going to be a really powerful pattern for enabling these sort of more imperative integrations with Gatsby components or Gatsby themes. So, yeah. So we have some shadowing guidelines that we share with anyone that starts building with a theme. And the first one is communication with us, the theme builders. You really want to make sure that no one is working on your change already, or it's in the pipeline or anything like that, just to consolidate effort. The second is less is more. You really want to shadow as few files as you can to achieve your final goal. Because if you were to shadow an entire component, that component, until you remove that shadowing file, is not going to be necessarily receiving, the same content updates or bug fixes or what have you. And the third one is communication again. So if you do shadow a component, it's important to tell the theme developers, mainly because that information is really useful to inform future development and features. So we have a couple stories here from people that have used the theme here at IBM successfully. One is from Connor Leach, our beloved content designer, and he was, with zero React experience and zero Gatsby experience, charged with taking our Carbon Gatsby site, a traditional Gatsby site with the config and all, and migrating it to using the Gatsby theme, which drastically cuts down on the amount of excess files and styles and things that we need. And so he was able to do that, which I think was a tremendous effort, pretty quickly using the Gatsby theme. And then Taylor is a front-end developer at Watson IT. They went the forking route about 6 months ago, and then recently made the decision to migrate the site back to using the theme, even foregoing some of the changes that they had made over those 6 months. And it's freed them up on the Watson IoT to direct their efforts elsewhere, which I think is sort of a critical win for developers using themes. And then they also get to benefit and contribute to the theme. Taylor contributed the editing GitHub link, which was really, really cool. So we have sort of a demo here. This was built by Lawrence here on the IBM Design for AI team. And Lawrence has zero React and zero Gatsby experience. we sort of like to have these like sort of, I guess, signature home pages where people using the theme can have or given the tools to kind of flexibly modify and create something that's unique to their brand. One really key feature here that we can kind of stress is that like we're able to do things like the skip to main content and enforce like best practices with like the tabability and accessibility of the site. And all of that is shared between people using the theme. Here we have the design language website, which is a site that we're currently migrating to also use the theme. You can see we have like this component, I guess, website switcher, which we populate with the design websites that in our little ecosystem. All of that content can be shadowed to be whatever little like content that you wish. So yeah, we have like our information architecture too is shared between users of the theme, so that in navigating the design language website, it feels familiar to somebody who might be familiar with the AI site or something along those lines. That's mainly just because we're sharing the same information architecture goals and components. And here's another example of the IBM research site as a work in progress by somebody who has next to no React or Gatsby experience, and it's been really cool to watch content authors and website developers be empowered to create stuff that looks and feels like the IBM design language, all the while focusing on their strengths, whether that be content design or their product, right? So we have a few theme takeaways. The first one being, and I hope everyone that sees this realizes the big win that comes along with empowering content authors. MDX is critical in that. The global MDX components allow our content authors to write rich markdown that creates like a really great user experience. And while that's totally possible with just native MDX, it's important that they feel like their content looks and feels and is on the same level as other websites that are using the theme. And, so yeah, you get a lot of things for free in a way that I think really empowers content authors. It saves developers time and overhead. There's sort of a hidden complexity in forking the Carbon website, and that if they don't understand the configuration, future changes to the configuration become difficult. And so yeah, we're saving them time in both shared theme development and also the configuration complexity overhead. Yeah, and it encourages community contribution. I think this is just a factor of everyone using the same tool. It's exciting for people to contribute back to the theme and see it used elsewhere. This is much more difficult if everyone's using sort of their own bespoke fork of Carbon that might not share the same, SAS tokens or styling approach. So it's really great to be able to distribute those contributions and have it percolate throughout the ecosystem of sites using the theme with just a simple single package update. So yeah, the themes allow us to align on form and function, which is super critical at IBM design. We want to have our sites look and feel unique, but also we want to have a common thread that connects us back to the IBM design language. And so having a unified approach in the way that we're using the theme and building out sites with the theme has been essential in that. And then the final thing, we kind of got into shadowing, and I would say that shadowing things is incredibly powerful. You really don't want to do it too much, or else risk losing that central tie to the theme, especially for these sort of monolithic themes that, or you're like a one-stop solution like ours is at the moment. And then mostly to provide props, and that first pattern that we addressed, I think, you're still using the core theme, and it'll provide, updates to that component. So yeah, shadowing is amazing. It's really exciting, and yeah, cool. So that's all we have for our slides here. Thanks so much, guys, for allowing us to participate.
Great, thanks, Allison and Vince. Really appreciate that. And we are going to transition into answering more Q&A, but just a quick reminder that you can also submit your questions on Twitter. Just make sure to tag GatsbyJS or the hashtag GatsbyJSAMA as we're doing an Ask Me Anything on Twitter now and through the next half hour after the webinar. Also want to mention that if you're looking for a way to get more involved with themes and build a theme yourself, consider joining the Gatsby Theme Jam at themejam.gatsbyjs.org. I'll put the link in the chat window as well. This is a fun way to contribute to open source ecosystem to build a theme. Your theme would be highlighted on this website in our showcase. And also all theme submissions get some fun exclusive swag. And then we're choosing 2 submitters to join us for Gatsby Days London in September or a Gatsby Days of your choosing next year. So feel free, if you're interested in participating more and getting involved with building a theme, to join our theme jam. Okay, so with that, let me take a look at the questions. Actually, first, let me open it up to Chris and Brent, who I know have been online trying to get to all the theme-related questions. Any questions, Chris, that you want to highlight or bring out now?
Sure. There was a question about, do themes only work with MDX, or can you pull in your content via GraphQL? Themes work with anything in the Gatsby ecosystem. So like that's kind of the point of what I was saying at the beginning of the webinar. You can specify your Gatsby config to contain any plugins that you want. It just so happens that the Carbon team chose to use MDX for their use case. And we are using MDX in the official themes as well. But if you don't like it for some reason, or you have like your content coming from a different source or from YAML or something like that, you just have to include the right plugins. There's no restrictions, there's no built-ins in terms of like you have to use MDX or you have to use Theme UI or you have to use CSS and JS or whatever. You can end up doing whatever you want if you have your own use case.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Another one around shadowing. Can a theme restrict what bits of it can be shadowed?
Everything in source is shadowed by default. So if you want to restrict what can be shadowed, I wouldn't suggest doing that anyway. The reason that we decided to shadow by default is so that theme authors wouldn't have to spend the time to enable all of the various different things that can be shadowed. And quite often, the decision to make something non-shadowable is a decision to restrict the ability of your consumers when they need to, when they have their 99% edge use case. You're basically preventing them from being able to do something or preventing them from being able to use your theme. So I wouldn't suggest doing that generally.
Okay, thanks. A couple questions for Alison and Vince. When content authors that are non-technical are updating a Carbon site or migrating a Carbon site, what does their work environment look like? Are they using a GUI, for example?
Yeah, so most of our content authors, we've like sat down with them for like 30, 45 minutes and helped them get a local environment set up. But a lot of them also just use the GitHub UI to update content that way. It just really depends on how involved their changes are.
And that was sort of like the motivation behind using Markdown and MDX specifically, is that it's a low barrier to entry, and people can, as they get more familiar with Markdown syntax, they can start doing things like using like code syntax highlighting and more advanced like MDX component features. So that was sort of it's kind of like a slow incline to contributing, which I find has been very successful.
Okay, great. Another question for you. Are there currently any product or marketing pages on IBM.com that are running the Gatsby theme?
Yeah, the AI site, which is the first example, which is that's ibm.com/design/AI. That was sort of the first out of the gate. We also have a couple sites that are internal to our network here that have used the themes to do some documentation for like our brand guidelines and things like that. Yeah, that
Great.
design/AI. Yeah. No, go ahead.
And Vince, if you have that link and you want to put it in the chat window as well, then everybody can get it from there.
Cool.
Okay, great. More questions coming in. What is the use case of starter? Hold on, let me read through it first. More questions about shadowing and.
Do you want me to take that starter one that you just started talking about? Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So
Thanks,
basically
Chris.
the question is, what is the use case of starters because it seems like themes provide the same functionality if you use component shadowing. The benefit of starters for themes is that you can start somebody up with the content and the directory is already set up as like a set of example content that they can then go delete and then continue to use the theme. So for example, in like Gatsby starter theme or Gatsby theme starter theme blog, the official starters for the themes, they come with content that you can then start your site up, see it working, see all the content, see how it works, then go back and delete the content and put your own content in. So there is a place for starters with themes. There's also a place for starters without themes if you are looking for a boilerplate and not a pre-made theme. If you're looking for a starting point to make your own theme or something like that. So there are use cases for starters still, even though themes exist.
Great, thanks, Chris.
Sorry, real quick. Yeah, just the we also have like just like we have we have a starter like for the theme, like Chris was saying, so that it's really easy for people to just get up and going with the theme. It's just like a command line option rather than having to create all the necessary directories and things like that from the get-go. So the starters are still really helpful for like kicking off a theme project.
Mm-hmm. Another question for Alison and Vince. What other Node.js projects are supported by IBM?
Wow, that's a good question.
That's a good question.
So our Carbon design system, so we have the IBM design language, which is like our high level, like philosophical design language. And then the Carbon is the design system, which is sort of the design language applied into usable components and code. And so our React library, our React component library at react.carbondesignsystem.com is our like foray into using that. And then as like IBM as a whole, those are the sort of the Node.js projects that we get to touch on here is our like React component library. And then the Gatsby and Gatsby theme has been our next push in that area.
Mm-hmm. Great. This next one may be for Chris. What is the best approach for a theme using GraphQL to allow other users to set up their own endpoints or data structures to populate content or build out pages?
So this is quite a long answer at this point. I would suggest taking a look at the live stream that Mikhail and Jason are going to put on Jason's Twitch channel. I don't know if you can bring that up with who is sharing the screen right now. But yeah, Jason and Mikhail are going to go over sort of advanced GraphQL schema customization patterns. And this is what's going to turn into the ability to let people basically source from their own locations and transform it into your own types. So for example, we have the official theme Gatsby theme blog. It has a blog post type. In the future, that blog post type will be able to be sourced from any CMS at runtime, basically, or at use time. Sorry, not at runtime. So you could choose to get it from WordPress or choose to get it from Contentful or Flat Files or something like that. And this schema customization live stream that Jason and Mikhail are doing is where you will find that information.
Great, thank you. Time for a couple more questions. There's two questions that are around Storybook. Do users import components from Gatsby for their projects or Storybook? What is the source of truth?
I think that's for the Carbon.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat the question?
Alison. Oh, sure. Do users import components from Gatsby for their projects or Storybook? What is the source of truth?
That's a great question. So in Gatsby, or the Gatsby theme, we have as a dependency the Carbon components like React library, which obviously has its own Storybook. So if you're meant to use any of the Carbon React like components in your content, or even as we do, like we have a shell component that we use to control the navigation, the theme has as a dependency the React library, so that React library is the source of truth. And then we have sort of a different approach to illustrating the components in action at the Gatsby theme Carbon website. Under components, you can see all of the components that some of them tied to the our Storybook React library, but some of them too we choose to document just here in the components. So yeah, as far as like a source of truth, we don't necessarily like build the wheel with the Carbon React components. We import those and use that as our dependency. But that's a good question. I think as people start building out sites with MDX and they realize how powerful having documentation and usage in line with the components, I think that a lot of people are going to start either erring towards solutions other than like a Storybook approach, or I noticed that Storybook is also trying to start have this like inline documentation approach for design systems coming up in the future. But we found that documenting the components in the website itself, in the example website, has been a really powerful way for someone that's just getting started. If they use the starter, the content's just right there. The documentation on all the components is right there. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered the question. It's kind of it's two different use cases maybe, but ideally you're not documenting the same components both in Storybook and then also in your own documentation. You don't want to really have disparate sources of locations where you have to update if anything happens with a component.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I also just added the link to Jason's live stream that Chris had mentioned. So I'm sharing it now, but also the link is in the chat window if you're interested in that. Let's see, I think we got to most of the questions. I'll just give a minute or two for any kind of last thoughts or words from Chris, and then go to Alison and Vince, the IBM team. So Chris, any last thoughts you want to leave with the audience?
If you have not used themes and are going to use themes and you have questions, hit me up on Twitter and I will be happy to answer them, or hit people up on, anywhere your local Gatsby.js people hang out.
Great, thanks, Chris. And Vincent, Alison.
Yeah, I think we're just really excited to be able to share this opportunity to tell about our story with themes. I could keep talking forever about the kind of technical decisions we made, and it gets really fun when you start getting into the various plugins and configuration. But overall, I hope that the takeaway is just that themes are going to be a tremendous tool for companies even at like an enterprise scale to start empowering content authors, empowering designers to really like own their content and, you know, stick to a common thread that like puts forth their like best efforts for content. It's going to be a really, really exciting tool to see develop for sure. Mm-hmm. Oh, and then also thank you so much to Chris and the Gatsby team who have been like tremendously helpful in our journey towards both migrating to Gatsby and then also the weird edge cases that we hit with themes. It's largely settled now, but I think it's the efforts of the Gatsby team has been tremendously helpful too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think we would have ever converted to MDX without Chris's help earlier this year, so much appreciated.
Great, thanks so much. Another big thank you to all our presenters, Alison and Vince and Chris. Really appreciate your time. And also for those working behind the scenes, the panelists, to answer questions in the chat window. So just a quick reminder, the webinar has been recorded and the link will be available on our website later today and sent to all the registrants via email. And if you have any additional questions and want to jump on Twitter, we're doing a Twitter AMA starting now for the next half hour. Just be sure to tag GatsbyJS or use the hashtag GatsbyJSAMA. So we'll talk to you either on Twitter or at our next webinar. Thanks so much.